And we're live. Welcome to World War One, Episode 2, The Black Hand. So, yeah, all right. Last week we kind of did the build up. World War One, Episode
2. Shit.
Bad Dodge can't get enough of his own voice.
I know. I hate it. Yeah. All right. So last week we did a little bit of the build up. This week it is Archduke Ferdinand being assassinated, and the dominoes start to fall. Right?
Yeah. What you have going on, and Farty here can correct me a little bit, is there were a series of things that have led to this build up. Okay, not the least of which is the Serbs themselves they've broken away successfully from the Ottoman Empire. All right, but they've also broken away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so they're trying to carve out their own little niche. And what their idea is they're going to create the great land of Yugoslavia, basically putting all the Slavic groups, which includes the Czechs and other groups that are well within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they're going to put them as part of the greater Serbia. All right, and they've had designs for a greater Serbia, and in fact, they had fought a couple of wars just previous. All right, with in conjunction like with the Greeks and everything else, overthrowing the Ottomans and seizing some of that territory. Now, during that time frame, of course, the Austro-Hungarians seized some of that territory too, to include Bosnia and Herzegovina, which the Serbs irritated the Serbs because that they considered certain areas of that should have been under them because of Yugoslavia, right?
They still do, actually.
Right. Yeah. So, which of course this is part of this. Now, initially, yeah, they seize this territory, everything looks good, and then the Hungarians decide, you know what, we're going to attack, and so they fight a second basic Balkan war, right? Where the Hungarians are feeling a bit froggy, right? The Serbians, of course, win that battle too. All right, so now the Serbs are thinking, well, we're some badasses. So the idea that the Serbs think that are just peaceful little ways, looking at the clouds and people and putting freaking flowers in the gun barrels, right? and the original flower chant is a real misnomer, okay? And there's a movement that takes place within Serbia, all right, of which the Black Hand is one of these groups. And they're a terrorist group from the perspective of the Austro-Hungarian Empire because they are trying to rile up the Slavic citizens that are we still fall within that territory.
And this is something that you'll find is actually carries on through history with things like Tito's Partisans and Arkan's Tigers. They've always had this interior military sort of mafia that goes on, made up of military officers and soldiers and stuff like that. And they've gotten away with a hell of a lot because of it.
Well, and it is ethnic strife if you want to look at it. They consider themselves ethnically, separate from the other groups. Now, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this time, approximately 24% of the population is ethnic German. They speak German. Okay. Another 20% is I'm trying to think what it was. It wasn't Slavic. Okay. I'm trying to think what it was. You had German, then what was it?
Austria and Italy.
Oh, Italians. That's right. I think it was Italians, right? So you have groups. Most of the population isn't Slavic, but a significant minority is. Over 40% are of some kind of Slavic defense. The Slovenians, for example. Obviously the Greeks, the Albanian, what becomes Albanian, those kind of areas are still considered Slavic, okay? And they've made deals with Russia because culturally, from a religious perspective, they're considered Greek Orthodox. The other thing to remember about that is the Slavic nations use Cyrillic, the Cyrillic alphabet.
Yep.
Okay, which is completely different. That's why you have like the Soviet Union, which we called USSR. They always had CCCP because it used the Greek's alphabets or the Cyrillic alphabet rather than the Latin alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then of course you've got the Ottomans, and the Ottomans are the ones that are being beaten back, and nobody likes the Ottomans. Okay, well, let's be perfectly frank here. Everybody's gone to war with the Ottomans at some point in time. All right, the Russians have gone to war with the Ottomans and so forth, but the British now, they had been in the position of trying to prop up the Ottomans to prevent Russia from gaining access to a warm water port. Okay, so there are several wars that happened in the 1870s between Russia and the British. All right, to try and hem Russia in to prevent its ambitions, its territorial ambitions for a warm water port. And then, of course, you end up with the rise of Germany, etc. So all these things are in play here. But it's really the formation of Serbia and everything else with the Black Hand. The Black Hand is, like I said, a terrorist group that is really, for all intents and purposes, being run out of Serbia that the Serbians know about. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not the Serbian government was actually full bore helping them. Okay. There's people that'll point out that no, that wasn't the case. But what can be said is that the Serbians weren't doing anything to stop them either.
No.
And that's all that really needs to be done, isn't it?
pretty much.
Well, if you know that a terrorist organization is operating, all right, within your territory, and they're fleeing to your territory so they can recover and recoup and run back across the border to go attack them, and you're not doing anything about it, yeah, you're kind of responsible to a degree. You're going to be held accountable. I mean, how else are you going to look at it? So they kill Archduke, however you say it, all right, Ferdinand. All right. So who is Ferdinand? He is the sole heir of Emperor Joseph. All right, who is the emperor of the Ottoman Empire. Okay. Now or not the Ottoman, I'm sorry, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So what you got now is he now says, okay, you just killed my son. We know it's the Black Hand. We know that the people that were involved in it, Giuseppe, Principal. How do you say his name? Principe, something like that. I can't.
Oh, but just Princip. That's the kind.
Yeah, Princip.
Okay. And he's now the killing of the Duke is quite interesting because they are planning an assassination, right? And they've got 3 cars that they're traveling in. They're moving along the road. One of the cars is hit with a grenade. 2 of the cars, then, including the Crown Prince, aren't harmed. They tear off toward a side road. It's a one-way street, so they got to come back again. And Princip happens to be standing there the second time that they arrive, and he then is the one who kills Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophia.
It was actually quite an amusing little anecdote. He thought that the grenade was successful, so he went, "Fuck this! I'll go off and grab a sandwich." And he's walked down this side street, grabbed the sandwich out of this cafe, and then walked out and said, "Holy shit! There's this cunt."
Well, I mean, he was committed. You have to admit that he was committed to the act of getting rid of the guy.
Yeah.
So the first thing is that the Austrians they talk to the Germans and they go, look, we want your support for what if we got to go to war with Serbia, right? And the Germans, they have at this time become the #1 industrial power in Europe. They have overtaken England.
Not just industrial, but they've also become the education center of Europe as well. And in this point here, this is where Germany was starting to look at the rest of Europe and saying, well, okay, if we had to go to war with England and America, it'd be great that we had all of our own resources. So if we took France under our wing somehow, then we'd have all the resources there. And the same with the Scandinavian countries. And maybe we might be able to absorb a few of their imperial colonies and stuff like that. So like in Africa, then we'd have oil resources and all this. That'd be a wonderful thing. Now, if only we had some friends. Oh, hang on, Austria, Italy. And there's your triple alliance there. But no one was really expecting the Italians, of course, and this isn't really a joke. This is actually something that became the joke because of the way Italy works. No one was really expecting the Italians to come forward and stand up with everybody. They did to an extent, but yeah, they weren't all that useful.
They were the big backstabbers, which we'll get into that. But the Germans, of course, yeah, they are looking at it from an industrial standpoint. Now, the United States, at this point, industrialized from its industry, its industrial output is so far and away above everybody else's. In fact, the United States output exceeds the entire European and British output combined.
Because it's also around this point in time you got Henry Ford with his fucking production line theory and all this kind of stuff, which revolutionized everything. Going just real quick, leading up to this industrially, Europe hadn't actually fought a major war in about 40 years by this point, and a lot of things had changed. You've got cordite, which now you've got small bore super velocity bullets and stuff like that. You've got artillery that can do non-line of sight. You've now got steam turbines for ships, which make them move a lot faster, and they could be built much more heavily. So now you got super heavy battleships and things like that being prevalent instead of being just sailing ships.
Yeah, you've got the British. The British especially are on the forefront of modern battleship design. In fact, they've created a series of modern battleships, which is causing everyone else to scrap their fleets. When the HMS Dreadnought is built, it basically so far outclassed every single ship out there that everyone starts doing a crash course in battleship building.
But one thing I'd have to say would be one of the most world-changing things was simply standardization of nuts and bolts and parts like that. Reproduction of matching accurate fucking parts, because before, when you had a machine built, it was literally someone turned a lathe and made a specific bolt for this specific part, and if that thing broke, you couldn't really just go down to the fucking hardware store and buy another one. You actually had to have someone machine one up. So when they started using specific gauge threads and course, types of courses and fucking, sizes and whatnot, and things were being built around the nuts and bolts, it made everything interchangeable, which meant that things could be done in they could be done en masse, and they could be done repeatable, and parts you wouldn't have to go, the Lee Enfield, I've got a screw that come out of my rifle, can you make me another one? No, you just go down to the armor and he's got 1,000 of the bloody things and anyone will fit. And this made fucking things way easier to produce, and it really revolutionized the industrial world.
It also caused a really it caused the populace of these nations to really misunderstand and misjudge the fact that war could even take place and what war would actually mean. And that's another thing that I don't think people really got a good idea about is the populations of Europe especially, right? They still had a romantic view of war from Waterloo on down, right? And the horrors of a mechanized war that would be coming, right, really didn't sit with them. And that was the people who that thought that a war was possible. Most people at this time, and the papers are full of this, were believing that there's no possibility of Germany going to war with England because we have such a great trading relationship, we couldn't possibly go to war. And there's no way that this could take place. So a lot of these guys are approaching this from a myopic point of view. Go ahead.
Go.
Yeah, no, speaking more to just the kind of mass industrialization of warfare, I mean, you're not only talking about, mass production of things like artillery and the mass mobilizations and raising of armies and using railways to ship them from point A to point B. But I mean, you're also talking even before World War One. There was the implementing of automatic weapons. I think one of the very first ones was the what was it? It was a French gun, the Shishot, I think it's pronounced, and then
Show shot.
Show
Yeah.
shot, and then the English came up with the Vickers machine gun, and the Show shot was, I mean, the Show shot was extremely shitty. It was a very awful gun. The American troops, before the implementing of the Browning automatic rifle of the bar, they had to utilize the Show shot, and it was a shit gun, always jammed and everything. But nevertheless, it was a fully automatic rifle, and so something like that is something that people did not count on being implemented.
In addition to that, the artillery has made, like Forty was saying, great strides. In fact, the French 76 was considered the premier, artillery piece at the beginning of the war. It had
breech loading.
It was a breech loading weapon that because of its recoil, the recoil mechanisms on it to accept the recoil allowed it to be fired accurately and consistently. You didn't have to bring it online. Up to that point, when you fired an artillery piece, it would roll back and you'd have to literally drag it back to its starting point in order to get, effective fields of fire and consistent fields of fire. And this was true throughout the war. Now, all of a sudden, because of the technological changes, the artillery is far, far and away more effective. And it truly becomes the quote unquote king of battle now.
And getting on to what 40 was saying with the machine gun, the quick story about Hiram Maxim. He was an American who was basically a tinkerer and inventor, and he was speaking to a friend of his and said, I'd like to make a shit ton of money out of my inventions. And his friend basically said, well, why don't you go and invent something that'll allow the Europeans to kill each other more efficiently? And that's how he came. That's actually what happened. And so he did invent the Maxim machine gun. He tried to sell it to the Americans. The Americans said, no, we don't want it. We've still got Gatling guns and we don't really use them. So what's the point on this fucking thing? He went to the British and then partnered up with the Vickers company. And he also went to Germany, and I think it was a Spandau Arms Works or WW1 or something like that. And they licensed the British version initially, the Vickers, because it was Vickers Maxim and Son. And there is a story about during World War One that the Germans were actually still paying licensing rights to the British to make the Vickers version of the Maxim gun, whilst they were using the Maxim against the British troops. But this also got as far as to China, and like little evolution thing. Like the Europeans weren't used to this new type of warfare. Like you had things like Rourke's Drift, the Boer War. So Rourke's Drift was your trapdoor rifles against Zulus, whoopie-doo, unarmed fucking, natives. And you got the Boer War, which was something similar. But by this time, you now had magazine-fed fucking 303 long Lee Enfield rifles. And this is still back in the days where they had a magazine cutoff. So you had 10 rounds in the magazine, but you'd only put one in the one up the pipe, and then you use that. You just open the bolt, chuck another one in, and if it got to a point where holy fuck, the Zulus are coming en masse, you'd open up your magazine cutoff, and then you got 10 rounds just fire away with. And that was a premise that like basically almost lived up to the late 1960s, which was if you gave a bloke a gun that could fire 100 rounds a minute, he will fire all of his ammunition in under a minute. So we must retard the amount of ammunition that they can fire so that at least they can sit in the battle for a good long while. And this is part of the reason why, say, even Australia, we had the self-loading rifle up until the late 80s, which was a semi-automatic rifle. But then you go to China with the Boxer Rebellion, and this was one of the first wars where machine guns were actually used in a tactical manner, and not very many people sort of paid attention to this. The Russians did. The French and English observers, they didn't really pay much attention to it. So by the time World War One does kick off, this fucking machine gun thing is a massive surprise. I think the Germans did sort of pay attention to it, and they started building machine guns like crazy. So this is the difference in evolution. You had European armies that hadn't fought each other since they had fucking, muzzle-loading rifles. Now they're going in with magazine-fed and machine guns and whatnot. And this whole, like, well, it worked with the natives, so it should work here. And, as everyone was saying, it's like, oh, it's the glory of battle, and, this is a gentlemanly act and all this kind of stuff, when that shit fucking changed on a dime.
Yep. Yeah. And then you also have the fact that now what do you have is you have the Russians, right? And the Russians were always a backwards group of people from a certain standpoint, but at the same time, the Russians have two things that most of the other countries in Europe don't have: lots of land and lots of frickin' people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so the Russians on paper, okay, look like they are a frickin' land-based powerhouse. Now, nobody considers the Russians as far as an industrial might. They don't have the ability to build the kind of warships that the rest of the nations are building. All right, but they do have the ability to field an army, and their standing army, all right, was about 1 million men already. That's their standing army. When they mobilized, they could mobilize another 3.5 million men. So when you look at that and you're like, holy crap, look at what they can field. Now, this all sounds pretty impressive, except for the fact that industrially, they couldn't supply them. They couldn't give them enough weapons. They couldn't give them enough rifles. They couldn't give them enough artillery pieces or anything else. So on paper, you got this 3 million man army, right, which the Russians greatly feared. All right. But from a power perspective, the industrialization perspective, it doesn't exist. But like you said, nobody had really come to the understanding of what that would mean in a war. Okay. So it was really over, and the Germans were really overestimating the capability of the Russians. All right. So what did the Germans do? I mean, because they're looking around and everybody's making war plans, scenarios. What if Britain goes to war with France? What do they do? What if France goes to war with Germany? What do the French do? What do the Germans do? Everyone's making war plans against one another, and including the United States. We have war plans against the British. We have war plans against the Germans. We have war plans against the French.
Getting back to the idealisms and all this kind of stuff, with Germany, they looked at Britain. They actually looked at Britain with some sort of camaraderie, because like they're the only two industrialized, highly educated fucking countries in Europe, pretty much. And they think, well, England's got a fucking great big empire. Yes, we kind of like some of that, because as I mentioned before, if they could absorb a few of the different countries in Europe, then that'll absorb some of their colonies, for oil. Well, how is that successful? And they saw that the British Navy, being the biggest navy in the world at the time, they saw that as a way of like, well, that's a key to their success. So they started building battleships like fucking crazy and all this kind of stuff. And they mainly, for a good long while, were just sitting in ports, thumbing their nose at the British, going, well, yeah, there's only one real reason why we are building these, is because we might have to go to war with you lot.
Well, there's that, but there's also the aspect of, if you're going to have an empire, and the Germans were not looking to expand on the continent of Europe. They were looking to expand in the other areas, which initially looks like Africa, maybe a few islands in the Pacific, but for the most part, they're looking at Africa. They are also looking at possibility, all right, getting involved, all right, in Latin America. Now, they understand that if they're going to do anything in Latin America, they're going to also, even if the British ignore them, they got to worry about the Americans, and of course, you got to go across the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And the Americans also have a fleet. Our fleet wasn't
brilliant.
It wasn't as powerful as the British fleet, all right, but it was still significant. All right, people forget about that we were very much concerned about the development of the battleships and so forth, and we had our own battleships. Were they as good at the time? No, they weren't. But America was always doing that. And then you also have, of course, in America, you have the Wright brothers, and you have the beginning of the airplanes. Now, they're toys, but the Americans, I mean, initially we were the ones that were developing planes. Now the military, from a military perspective, we weren't looking at them that way. Everyone was looking at it from a civilian perspective. We were already starting to use planes for mail routes and things like that. We weren't, and of course, Americans, because of our love of speed and everything, you see them doing things like, having races and things like that. But what they're not doing necessarily is they're not putting weapon systems on them. They're not really thinking about putting weapons platforms on them. Unlike the Europeans that go, huh, what could we do with these things? Well, we could put machine guns on them.
I kind of love the Disney version of how the evolution of the military aircraft during World War One started, and at the beginning they were just using Blériot monoplanes and things like that as spotter aircraft, and imagine the cartoon as two planes passing each other, and you got the British guy and the German guy, and as they pass, it's like at first they were all nice and friendly, and as they pass, they get a little wave like hello, oh yeah, hi. And then this happened for a little while, and then all of a sudden one guy thought, maybe if I could do something to the other guy, he won't be able to see my line. So you see the two planes pass each other, and one guy throws a brick at the other guy, and it bounces off his head. He's like, ah! So then the next guy thinks, well, maybe I should carry a pistol. And then as they come past, the German pulls out his fucking Mauser C98, fucking fires a round. And then the other bloke thinks, right, well, fucking, then the arms race basically built from that. And then, so the British guy come past with his 303 next time, take a fucking pot shot at the German. Then they think, oh, well, let's put machine guns on it. And then, it was a funny fucking cartoon. That's basically how it evolved.
So here you have the death now of the Archduke. All right, the Austro-Hungarians decide, okay, we need to take Serbia down, and what they're really concerned about is Serbia, basically their interference with their empire specifically, right? So they want to punish Serbia. So they know that the Germans, because they've gone to the Germans, that they've got German support, and so they issue an ultimatum saying, here's these plans, and they issued 13 separate things that are going to be a part of it, to include that the court systems will be run by the Austro-Hungarians. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The Serbians, of course, in a surprise move, actually agree to all but one of these terms, but they know that the Austro-Hungarians are not going to accept this, okay? And they've already got assurances from Russia, all right, and they've already started to mobilize. So the mobilization between Austro-Hungarians and the Serbians has already begun and begins to take place. The British, at this point, though, are looking at this going, what the hell are you idiots doing? And they attempt, at this point, to say, look, all right, let's just keep this as a regional conflict. All right, let's do this from an international. Let's have an international discussion about this. Okay, and so they were actually, the British were actually trying to play peacemakers here, trying to say, look, if conflict takes place, let it be between just the Austro-Hungarians and the Serbians, right? And to be honest, if it would have stayed just between the Austro-Hungarians and the Serbians, it would have been interesting. It would have been an interesting conflict, all right, to see who would have won. All right.
Because you got the Austrians who have got an army 10 times the size of the British, but by this point, because they've been paying off the Yugoslav state, or the Slavic states, to keep them happy about the whole fucking taking Bosnia part, they were almost fucking broke. So if they did go to war, they got the manpower, they got the weapons, they got the ammunition, they just don't have the money to pay their soldiers.
And they don't have the leadership either, because many of those soldiers are Slavics.
Yeah. On the other hand, you got Russia fucking supplying and all this kind of stuff. But remember, Russia isn't the economic and industrial powerhouse that it was by the end of World War II. So
that's true. And what's more is that they don't have a border with Serbia. You've got to remember, the Romanians and the Bulgarians are the ones that are actually bordering Serbia. For the Russians to actually send supplies, they would have to get them through that point. Okay.
And also by this point too, the Germans had already had made a an alliance with the Ottomans. Then this fucking scared the shit out of the Russians, because that basically could close off the Dardanelles.
Yeah. So here, let me share this with everybody, if I can. On it.
Well, while you're doing that, let's talk a little bit about the Black Hand themselves. When were they formed? Do we know that?
The Black Hand was basically formed in about 1910. All right, so about 4 years before, as you have the creation of the Black Hand, and this is, like I said, this is part of the Yugoslav movement. This is, this is part of the Yugoslavia. Okay, or the idea that we're going to have the one world, the one Slavic nation under under Serbia, basically with Serbia being the leader. Okay.
Yeah, and the Black Hand was, it wasn't exactly like a group of ragtag dipshits. I mean, maybe later on in the war divulges into that, but when it was initially formed, it was formed by officers of the army of the Kingdom of Serbia, or whatever the official army's called. So, I mean, these are, the founders have military training. They understand tactics, and so I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to kind of shift gears a little bit to have that include assassination.
Well, a lot of their blokes were their own soldiers and stuff like that. So you had this autonomy of the officers basically having free run on how their blokes get trained and indoctrinated, and their thought process and all this kind of stuff. So, like I said, it was a fucking easy breeding ground to breed your own little mafia.
Okay, so this map shows you where Russia is in regards to Serbia, right? And obviously where Austria-Hungary is in regards to. I mean, you can see that you have Romania, you have Bulgaria, you have the Ottoman Turks still. Serbia is not directly connected to Russia. All right, and this is important because Russia can't directly supply, Russia can't directly help Serbia. And in fact, during this entire conflict, the Serbians are basically surrounded on three sides and never do get the kind of support that they need. They never are able to resupply themselves. Now they fight a defensive war in that they go into the mountains and it turns into a bloody mountain campaign. All right. But at the same time, they are logistically, they are in a bad situation. Okay. And while the Serbian government kind of knew that at the same time, they're thinking, okay, well, we've already fought, several battles. We got some pretty tough people here. We can go toe to toe with Austria-Hungary without any problems. And as long as the Russians can give us supplies, if the Romanians or the Bulgarians will let them give us supplies, because they don't like the Austro-Hungarians anyway, right? Then we're golden. Okay, so they're not as stressed about this. They're not as fearful of war as people think they were. Okay, so Austro-Hungary gives its ultimatum. All right, the Germans are now they know they've got to help their ally Austria-Hungary, right? But at the same time, they're not really looking at this going, are we really ready for a war yet? Okay, and they were like this until the Russians, where Tsar Nicholas of Russia, all right, doesn't want a war. All right, you can see it in the documents that he's writing to the Kaiser, right, who's his cousin, saying, we don't want this war. Unfortunately, a number of his advisors are giving him really bad advice about saying, well, you have to start mobilizing just in case Austria-Hungary, takes the attack to us, because if they mobilize the number of troops, they're going to be on our border as well, which is true. Okay. Nicholas says, okay, well, instead of going to a full mobilization, which the Germans are saying don't mobilize, we'll just do, quote unquote, a partial mobilization, right? We'll just partially mobilize. We'll only call up 500,000 of the 3 million. The problem with that is there's no plans for partial mobilization. The Russians, they've never contemplated. They've contemplated mobilizing or not mobilizing, not partial mobilization. So where do you come? Where do you supply? How do you supply? Where do you put this partial mobilization at? They have no contingency plan like this, right? And as they start to partially mobilize, Germany warns them: stand down. Stand down, or we will mobilize. It will mean war with us. The Kaiser tells him this. But at this point in time, the die is already cast, and Nicholas says, okay, I can either stand down and let Serbia and let it go and lose all face, or I can support them and go to full mobilization. And he decides to go full mobilization. And once he goes full mobilization, the Germans go full mobilization. Once the Germans go full mobilization, the French go full mobilization. And the Germans dust off the von Schlieffen plan.
Which is
basically taking over France.
It's the von Schlieffen plan calls for, okay, if you have to fight a two-front war against the Russians and the French, we figured the French would be easier to beat, so you beat the French, and then you could mobilize against the Russians. You do a holding action against the Russians while you take out France.
And it's interesting to see just on that too, that the similarities between World War I and World War II is that basically it involved the Germans taking the French from the north. A big sweeping movement to take France from the north all the way down to the south. The only difference was that World War I was purely horse-drawn, which did cause a lot of delays and whatnot, as you can see here, which did delay the process a hell of a lot. But World War II had not completely mechanized. There still was a fuck ton of horse-drawn activity and whatnot, but especially in the rear echelons and supply lines. But yeah, your panzers could move a hell of a lot quicker, and this basically made the Schlieffen plan a lot more effective. But yeah, it's pretty much the same as World War II.
Now, the von Schlieffen plan, which you can see here, you'll notice that the border with Germany, they're only focused on the north. The entire east coast of France, for the most part, or the eastern border of France against Germany, is more or less ignored. Okay, it's rugged territory; it's hard to move through, and the Germans are willing to risk, right, the incursions of the French incursions into those areas, because they figure with this big wheel movement, they can capture Paris and end the war. So even if they made some small gains in these other areas, it'll be more than compensated for with these gains here. But you'll also notice that in order to do this, they're going to go through Luxembourg and they're going to go through Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
And Belgium, of course, is playing the same stupid, duplicitous game that it plays 20 years later, just like the freaking Netherlands does, right? Which is, oh, the Germans won't attack, right? And they've convinced the British to say, look, if they violate our neutrality, England will come in.
But also, too, the Schlieffen plans also, as you can see in the top left corner, it intersects fucking the Calais and fucking Cherbourg and all that kind of shit. So they're basically trying to cut the British off at the same time.
Yes, they are trying to cut the British off, the supplies off at the same time. Now, this is what the plan is. The plan is to do a delaying action against the Russians on the east, while they quickly overwhelm the French. This is the von Schlieffen plan, right?
Well, I mean, it would have all worked out perfectly fine if France would have played ball and just gave up, right?
Well, if the thing is about this plan is, as you can see, it's extraordinarily complicated, right? Furthermore, they're expecting the Belgians, all right, to not fight, okay? And you'll notice right here in Antwerp, the Belgians have stood ground. They tried to fight. Okay, now the British, as things start to develop, actually have the BEF, which is around in this area. They start pushing this line up there. This becomes the race to the sea. This is where you see the line stabilize. All right, but the von Schlieffen plan also called for this great wheel movement, and von Schlieffen had constantly said, no matter what you do, this far end movement, you cannot take troops from this far end, because in order to deal with the center, they have to be able to move on their own, because if you take any troops away from here, the plan can fall apart because you never get to frickin' Paris. And of course, what ends up happening is as they move into Belgium, there's some significant areas, especially through the Ardennes, that cause delays and cause the Germans to take troops from this far wing and bring it in tighter. And as a result, you end up with, the movement, basically the race to the sea. All right, so that's where a good portion of the von Schlieffen plan falls apart. Now, the reality is the von Schlieffen plan wasn't workable with the new timetables because of industrialization anyway. Okay, it just wasn't going to work the way von Schlieffen imagined. All right. The other aspect of it was, of course, is once you start the mobilization process and you start sending people to the fronts, all right, everyone's kicking off at once. So Germany then declares war, against Russia, which then brings in. They tell Belgium that they have to stand aside because France declares war on Germany because they are Russia's ally. All right, England declares that they will stay out of it as long as Belgium's neutrality is respected. The Germans say, "Well, screw you." Okay, so they jump. Okay. The Italians, who are supposed to be the allies of the Germans, say, well, we're staying neutral, at least initially, before they backstab them a few months later. All right. The big thing, though, that catches people off guard is the Ottoman Turks. Because the British are looking at this going, okay, how can we help the Russians? Because we know the Russians are going to need help. Okay. So they're thinking, well, we can send ships through the Dardanelles. All right, we can supply them, into the Black Sea, and then we can, through Odessa, we can help them against the Austro-Hungarians.
But the Ottomans, being a good friend of Germany, decided to close the Dardanelles, opposed to Russia and everybody else. And this means that, you got that, this is where, is it 90% of fucking Russia's wheat crop gets fucking shipped out of bloody the Caucasus.
Yeah, the Ottomans, though, have a secret treaty. This is the one secret treaty that surprises people. All right, is they have a secret treaty with the Germans, and they say, okay, we're going to delay things, and then they declare war against the Russians and join the general mayhem. Now, the British, which are surprised about this, are also delighted about this, because it gives them opportunities to seize territory that they didn't have before, specifically in the Middle East.
And it was at the point where Germany basically fiddled with bloody Belgium's neutrality and brought Britain into the war. This is also the point that most of the rest of the Commonwealth, including Australia, also joined the war. Yes,
when the British end up declaring war, the entire British Commonwealth, goes with them. That includes Canada, that includes Australia, that includes
New Zealand.
What about the Americans? We were just sitting back going, that's funny, right?
Yeah, pretty much. The American attitude at the time pretty much was, this is a European thing, fuck them, let them have it. It's got nothing to do with us. We're still living fine. Fuck it, let them have it.
Well, the initial response in the United States is this. Good, we can sell weapons to both sides.
Yeah.
All right, that is the initial American response. It's not an exaggeration, folks. They were looking at it going, oh boy, we could sell weapons to Germany. We've got trade routes. They'll be killing each other at wholesale, and we could be the arms merchants from hell. And of course, the British go, no. You can try and sell to Germans, but if we find cargo that's going to Germany, we're going to seize it, and it's going to become British cargo.
Well, okay, so that's interesting. Right? Okay, so the British response is, fuck off, you Yanks. You're not going to sell Germany. We could have easily fallen in line with Germany at that point, right? I mean, the British start seizing American cargo. We don't do well with that.
Well, you could, however, you had to face the Royal Navy with all the way across the other side of the Atlantic trying to get to Germany.
The thing is that while that is true, and that there were Americans that wanted us to go to war on the side of Germany. The problem is while the British began doing that, the Germans started sinking cargo ships, including American ships. It's like down to the bottom of the ocean to go.
Yeah,
we can't have it. No cunt can.
Well, they are German. I'm gotta give them a little bit of a leadway there.
So the United States is caught. And like I said, initially they were like, woohoo! And then they said, this kind of sucks because both sides are interfering with commerce and trade.
Yeah, everybody hates our asses. But it is interesting if Germany wouldn't have been sinking American merchant shipping, then we probably would have fell in line with the German cause, right? And that could have really changed world history.
Possibly. I mean, but the United States, you got to understand, we understood that the British. All right, you got to. This goes back to an attitude that goes to blockades, okay, and the rules of blockades. The British respected. You got to remember this. The British respected the American blockade during the Civil War. For the United States to truly get upset and object to the British blockade of Germany, it would be a two-faced way of looking at how to deal with the naval realities at the time. And the United States was not going to do that.
And also, too, you also got to remember that historically, America has a better relationship with France than mainly anybody else. And if anything, if it did come down to the Germans, between the Germans and the British, the French probably would have stood up and gone, "Hey, fucking, what about us?"
And that's very true too. To be honest, we did have more of a national goodwill toward the French than we did toward any other European nation at the time. People don't realize that, but at the time, our greatest European ally was always France up to that point. Not England, not the British at all. In fact, the United States had a plan. They had Operation Red, where we were prepared to go to war with England and take Canada. We would have invaded Canada.
We totally should have did it.
Well, you can still do it now. Most of the Canadians are too fucking stoned to fight nowadays anyway. So it'd be just like, Marines walk in and it's like, dude drops his fucking bonga. Dude, oh, fuck, we're Americans now. Shit, where's that crack pipe?
Yeah. the problem is we'll end up with too many beavers, and we don't need one beaver's enough. I don't need a whole freaking city full of them.
No, you can. That's the benefit of it. You can go to fucking war with Canada, and then you just round up all the beavers and execute them because they committed war crimes.
Well, if we would do that, but we're not going to do that, unfortunately.
Pansies.
All right, so let's get back on topic here. When it comes to the dominoes starting to fall, it really was the German invasion of Belgium, right?
Basically, yeah.
It really it forced the English into the war.
It forces England into the war, but the big domino that fell was the fact that the Russians mobilized. Right, Russian mobilization. If the Russians had not mobilized, if they just said, "Look, the Serbians can fight the Austro-Hungarians, and we'll just let it go," if that would have taken place, then it would have just stayed a regional conflict, and it wouldn't have been. Now, most likely, Serbia would have been crushed eventually, okay? But nobody else would have generally gotten involved a whole lot. I don't think any of the rest of the nations would have gotten involved. But because Russia mobilized, all right, Germany was saying, okay, we got to attack Russia. We have to do a delaying action first. We know Russia has an alliance with France, so we got to take out the French. I mean, that's where the dominoes start to fall. Right, it's really Russian mobilization.
Okay, so we kind of touched upon it a little bit, but let's go back to Ferdinand. How much do you have to have? Like, was the most unlucky dude ever, right? Like, they tried to kill him 3 fucking times, and his driver takes a wrong road, and bam, he gets fucking killed. Like, what the
Well,
fuck?
I mean,
lots of people were trying to they were trying to assassinate people all the fucking time. Like Queen Victoria, I think, had about 20 assassination attempts over her lifespan. That shit happened a lot.
yeah, it's not a surprise that people would be targeting them. The biggest surprise was the fact that in this case it was a bad freaking a series of bad personal choices. All right, that Ferdinand didn't need to be where he was. They were just trying to make a show of the Serbians, even though they had been warned that the Black Hand may try to move against them. They had been warned. Their own intelligence services knew that this was a dangerous thing, and instead of going with a full, complement of security forces, they just went in 3 cars. Right. And once the first car got blown up, you would think, okay, here's the scenario. We get the hell out of here and we don't go back.
You also got to remember too, Dodge. It wasn't like 10 years later that his cousin Nicholas Nicholas the Tsar of Russia, his whole fucking family got wiped out.
Oh well, yeah, we'll get to that. But no, the thing is, yeah, they blew up the first car, right, MC? And then he decides, I want to go see the people that were injured. Like, dude,
Yeah.
just get the fuck out of Dodge. What the fuck are you doing?
It's bravado. Yes, these are my people. You want to sit there and show that you care about your people, but it wasn't the time to do it. That's what especially when you got your wife involved. I hate to say this, but when your wife is in the same car, doing that kind of bravado is just stupid.
Maybe he just didn't like his wife.
Why, you think he's going to use her like a freaking shield? I mean, that's going to kind of destroy your whole reason for going back then, don't you think?
Maybe he thought, hang on, they got the wrong car. Let's drive past again. Maybe she'll cop a grenade.
You guys are brutal, but yeah, I mean, it's so, and of course, neither him nor and his wife, neither of them had any children. All right, so there was no other heir in that regard.
Yeah, the royal line died right there. And he was what, 50 years old? His dad was in his 80s,
Yes.
right? So, yeah, the royal line dies right there, and everybody marks that as the beginning of the war. I mark the beginning as the German invasion of Belgium. That's where I mark the beginning at.
And that happened about a month later. Because it didn't just kick off. Like, it wasn't like, fucking Archduke Ferdinand got shot and then the next thing you know, cunts are running across the border about an hour later. This actually took about a month. So, with the Austro-Hungarians going to the Germans and saying, right, well, this is this and this is that. And then the fucking Germans saying to the Russians, don't you fucking mobilize. And them coming back and saying, no, well, fuck you, we will. This all took a month.
Yeah, it takes about a month for everything to fully kick off to where the British are involved. And if you look at it from the British, the British involvement, now the British have already started preparing. Though this is the other thing that you got to remember: the British were actually mobilized much sooner than everybody else. They had already put troops. The British Expeditionary Force was already in France. They had already moved elements into France already. And into Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
All right, in preparation for just in case. Now, where they wanted to go, where they wanted to put troops, they wanted to put troops in frickin' in Holland. And the Dutch were like, well, no, if you put troops here, then it might invite the Germans in. The same comment that they made 20 years later. No, you might invite the Germans in. Okay, and so as the Germans basically move in, they basically take out Belgium, yeah, but they also just basically walk in and take frickin', the Netherlands, the Dutch. So they basically control them for the remainder of the war.
Mhm.
Okay, so 40, you've been muted for a little bit. Are you still here? No? Take that as a no. Okay. 40, from the Australian perspective, you're just dragged in kicking and screaming because you're part of the British Empire, right?
Not necessarily. I mentioned this before, but like we kind of saw it as the great adventure. As soon as the Mother England went to war, right? Well, okay, boys, do your part. Fucking be a man among men. Fucking bloody go join up. And right from the beginning, we had the people who were too old try and join up. We had people who were way too young, like we had kids as young as 12 lie about their age and fucking sign up. And at that point in time, the recruiters didn't give a shit. They're just like, oh, cool, well, fucking cannon fodder, yippee doo. This is before the whole bloodbath of like the Somme and Ypres and all that kind of stuff came out, and people started learning what it was all really about. But it was seen as the great adventure, a heroic fucking bloody thing that men do. So yeah, it was seen as a duty, pretty much.
Yeah, well, no, and when it comes to like the great adventure, that's how most wars are fought in the beginning, at least, right? Everybody is excited. We're going on the great adventure.
Well, that was the attitude at the time, and that was mainly because like the the media that was coming out of those kinds of things, like even the Boer War, that was a big event that Australia was involved in, and that was seen as the great adventure off in some far dark off land and all this kind of shit. And the media that came back from it was, oh, our valiant boys did this, that, and the other thing, and it was never like body counts and all this kind of shit. And it's only sort of getting towards the end of World War One when, like I mentioned before, you had the suffragette movement. You had there was one particular reporter, I can't remember his name, who I think it was at the Battle of the Somme, came back and he wrote a massively scathing article about the mismanagement of the British hierarchy and how many of our blokes got killed needlessly and all this. And this is when the public sort of went, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't as good as what we thought it was. But it was kind of like during World War II, the different attitude was we knew what we were fighting against. The Germans were really bad and all this, and we had to actually stop it. But then you go into Korea and Vietnam, where it's like, hang on, we're just fighting ideology here. It's not really like the same thing as the last one. And then public attitudes have changed, and it's from like say Korea and Vietnam onwards where people sort of start to question, hang on, where are we really going? This isn't as much of an adventure. Why am I going 1,000 miles away just to fucking get killed on some far off land?
Well, and that goes back to the attitude of the people not understanding what mechanized warfare is going to be about.
Well, no, and this is another interesting aspect of World War One. The beginning of the war was a mobile war, almost like World War II. But then they get bogged down in the race for the sea, and they end up going into trench warfare, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Because it's the beginning of learning how to best defend yourself. All right, yeah, it begins people charging and so forth. But the first thing that people are learning is they're coming into general movement, but they haven't developed certain techniques, right, to move against an entrenched position. And once people started realizing, okay, to establish a really effective trenched position, machine guns in depth work really well. All right. This was all part of that learning curve of what machine guns could do if they got placed in a defensive type of a perimeter and how best to do this. So it was a learning curve initially.
Yeah, and it's not until right up until the end, and it's one large part of it is the aircraft, because it's right at the end where we see fucking combined forces action, and this is your infantry being supported by tanks and artillery, walking fire artillery, and in some cases aircraft as well, with close air support. And that shit just didn't exist right at the beginning of the war. Because remember, like I said, we had this mentality of the last war we fought was with muskets, and up until then, yes, we had repeating rifles and stuff like that, but they were only against fucking natives and shit like that didn't really know how to fight. So that was the mentality that they did have. So charging machine guns was a good idea at the time because they didn't really know better.
Well, no, and that's an interesting aspect too. Is you still have cavalry charges? You know, like they're on horseback charging these machine gun nests. That's insane.
Yeah, well, that was also seen as like, well, they were shock troops. I mean, like the whole point of your cavalry was that they not only could move fast, but they were a fucking terrifying sight to behold, especially when they're running towards you, you know, with all the blokes screaming and carrying on. And that was literally the only thing they really did have to counter the machine guns. We got to cross this space of land. We got to do it fucking quick. We don't have tanks. We don't really know how to use our artillery and all this kind of stuff. Right, get the cavalry in. And it just didn't work out well.
And what's more is the Germans were very well prepared to deal with the Belgians, right? And they expected the Belgians to hold up into their fortresses, and they were prepared to take out those fortresses. And one of the things that, of course, they do as the battles basically begin is they bring in rail guns. And, you know, the same kind of rail guns, similar, although more powerful, right, that you witnessed at the end of Petersburg, right, where the Union brings in, you know, guns that have to be on rails, and they literally destroy these fortresses one at a time. It takes time, however. It isn't something that's a quick event. It is, and that time gives the French and the British forces, all right, gives them all sorts of time to start dealing and saying, okay, let's secure this area here. Let's blunt these areas of attack, which begins to push that race to the sea. As they stabilize one front, then okay, we'll do a flanking movement. Okay, then we'll save that flank, and then we'll just keep moving the flank and flank. And both sides are now trying to flank the other side. So you end up with this where the Germans are running to the right, trying to get to the French flank, and the French and the British are going to the left, trying to turn the German flank. And basically, they go all the way up in a series of meeting engagements that they then solidify with trench works as they go all the way up. And an interesting thing that also happens is that the French have a bottleneck problem trying to get their troops up north. And they actually do this now. They actually succeed in sending up their troops because there's this great patriotic call with taxis.
Yep.
They throw them into taxis and they start moving. You know, the taxis are literally taxi cabs driving to the front and then driving the troops to the front and returning and driving. It's like an inverted, you know, Dunkirk.
No, and that's funny too because the taxi drivers actually got paid also. The meter was running the whole time.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the whole von Schlieffen plan, which was supposed to be a delaying action, turns into one big solidified front. Meanwhile, the Russians now are involved in fighting both the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. Right, the Austro-Hungarians are also fighting with the Serbs. Right, so there's multiple fronts that they're begin to deal with, and then of course what happens?
Well, the Russians lose a lot, right? They get pushed back repeatedly.
The thing, what you end up with is Russians make some real major mistakes, but aside from that, you also have the wonderful Italians now decide to switch sides and instead of joining the Germans like they're supposed to, actually join the Allies and attempt to attack the Austro-Hungarians.
Yeah, there is one thing, if I remember correctly, about the Eastern Front between specifically the Germans and the Russians, and that is the Russians initially mobilized and were kind of making their way there. And as they were kind of pushing into Germany, I think they found out that they couldn't utilize their railroads to the fullest extent because there was actually a problem in terms of the gauges.
Yep.
for basically there was a difference in the construction on the Russian railroads and the German railroads,
Yep.
and so
One
you
used
can't.
narrow gauge, the other one used the wide.
Standard gauge. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
standard and narrow.
So they couldn't support their troops effectively enough at the front lines, and that's how the Germans ended up holding the ground and then pushing them back.
Well,
Okay, all right. Did the Europeans not watch what happened during the American Civil War? Because all these issues, the trench warfare, came into play at the end of the American Civil War. The gauge issue with the fucking railroads, that came into play during the American Civil War. Did they not fucking pay attention?
No, not really. And as I mentioned before, like with the Boxer Rebellion, it was mainly only the Russians that paid attention on how to use machine guns properly. And like I said, they'd already fought some wars in the meantime with newer weapons and stuff like that, and thought, well, this is still how we can do this. Not realizing that you're not fighting natives, you're fighting a concerted effort against a similarly armed population. Yeah. Now, yeah, with what 40 said, yeah, like yeah, the Russians had their own rail gauge, the narrow gauge, and the rest of Europe had this standardized, well, the standard gauge, which was a lot wider. And that was standardized all across Europe, but the Russians just want to be different. So
you're not telling the Americans anything new. So, but anyway, yeah. And one of the things is as they begin to come in, what you end up with is a battle. They invade Prussia, which is the industrial heartland of Germany. However, what you have from the Germans and the Germans on that front are probably the two best leaders that they have. All right, Ludendorff and Hindenburg.
Yeah.
And
real quick, Melissa, I'm reading the chat. I see you guys in there. Just throwing that out there because they don't think we read the chat at all.
Well, I haven't been paying attention to the chat, I'll be honest. So they have reasons to say that. But Ludendorff and Hindenburg understand, okay, the Russians want to move in. And so what they do is they basically lay a trap. And at Tannenberg, they let the Russians come in. They then basically surround with a flanking movement the entire Russian army there. I think was the Third Army or Fifth Army. I can't remember which army it was, which one it was. But they surround the entire army and basically force the surrender of close to 200,000 troops.
Sounds staggeringly like a marathon.
It becomes very close to, they were trying to create what do you call it?
But basically, you cave in.
Or Khan. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But you're describing like the center line caves a little bit and the flanks extend outward, and you basically have them encircled.
Right, the Battle of Khan, or Cannae, or however they pronounce it. I don't know how to pronounce it.
It's Khan.
Well, no, and that's one interesting aspect to World War I is just the sheer numbers of troops engaged in every single battle. It was astronomical.
Oh yeah, and the dead in some of the battles, like the wounded and casualties and all that kind of stuff, basically shits all over the fucking American Civil War. In most of their battles, yeah, okay, you got a few thousand here. We have battles where it was like tens and tens of thousands in one day.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Shiloh, anybody? Don't shit on the American Civil War too much, buddy.
In a 3-day battle, there was 50,000 dead at freaking Gettysburg.
That's 3 days. We lost that, I think, pretty much in one day on the Somme. That was just Australia.
Yeah, but the Somme had to take place if it was going to save France.
It could have been handled better, but yeah.
Well, in certain regards, yeah, but really, the Battle of the Somme, we haven't gotten that's a long.
But the
Battle of the Somme had to take place, or the British had to do the Battle of the Somme. If they hadn't, Germany would have won the war.
Well, isn't that one of Churchill's biggest mistakes?
No, that was Gallipoli, the Dardanelles.
Yeah, that's Gallipoli.
Oh, Gallipoli. Okay, yeah.
No, well, another thing, just real quick on the Somme, is that it wasn't just one battle. There was several like huge battles that were individual from the entire campaign, and in basically each of those times, it was just a fucking bloodbath.
Yeah, I mean that's what happens on the Western Front. Is there the mass casualties and the mass death? All right, so much more so it starts to take place, but that's going to be going forward, and I don't think we're necessarily ready to go forward from there. At least not.
Well, no. Okay, so why exactly does the Ottoman Empire throw their lot in? Because they had the most to lose, didn't they?
Well, actually, yes and no. They've also got the most to gain because you got to remember if Serbia gets reduced, right, they get to take back all that territory that they lost to those assholes just a few years before. They're looking at it. Go ahead.
And also, too, it was also another way of the Ottomans trying to regain some of their old empire too, like say, for instance, the genocide in Armenia and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah, that's all a part of it. You got to remember they've been pushed back. This was an opportunity to seize back the initiative. All right, and say, okay, we're going to go back on the offensive. Now, well, hindsight's 2020. Was this a really good idea? No. All right, but you've got assurances from the Germans, and what's more is, from their perspective, their great enemy, right, is the Russians, and they've got the Russians now in a bad spot. They got the Russians in a great pincer movement. Right? They've got them between the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and now the Ottoman Turks. They've really got the screws to the Russians.
And just on the Dardanelles alone, the Ottomans control the Dardanelles. That was a massive fucking shipping route for the Russians. Just closing that off fucks them completely.
Right. So they're looking at it from the perspective of, well, if the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians can easily defeat them, we get to a lot of this territory that we've lost, we can now seize back. All right. Because the Serbs now, with the Serbians had won battles, now with them being the losers, they're going to have to be forced to give reparations. They're going to have to be forced to give a lot of this territory back. Now, is it a stupid idea? Well, yeah. All right, because yeah, their empire, is quite broad, and therefore it can be attacked on multiple fronts. But if the Germans are busy holding down the British, then they don't have to worry about it. But of course, the British, aren't, they've got the British fleet, the Grand Fleet. Basically, they're looking at one another for much of the war. But at the same time, the British assets are far beyond what anybody else has from a naval perspective. And they can begin the rest of their campaigns. And to be honest, they can easily march in supplies and actually send it straight to France. And then from France, if they have to, ship it straight down into the Mediterranean, straight through France, without anybody getting involved.
So why exactly does Japan decide that it needs to join the war? Because that's one aspect nobody really talks about ever, is the Japanese involvement in the war.
Well, the Japanese have a great relationship with the British. When the British, they make a deal with the British to say, look, if you tell us to, if you want us to, we will wipe out the German colonies, the German island colonies that are in these areas, and we'll seize them.
Yeah.
And that's what they do.
Yeah, just before the war, Japan actually became an industrial power, which put them on the same sort of, not so much superpower, for what a better term, like a major league player in the world. So, the Germans, the Americans, the British, being all industrial powers, and then Japan comes along, and they go, right, well, we want to be an industrial power. We need a navy. Okay, who do we see? The British have got the best navy in the world. Okay, let's go over there. And the Vickers Armstrong Company, yep, we'll build your battleships and all this kind of stuff. So they had basically British standard fucking type battleships and whatnot. They modelled their navy off the Royal Navy, not so much the Army. But yeah, there's
what's more is they've had a fight with the Russians. And they a naval battle, right, where they have beaten the Russians badly. The Russians, they had beaten the hell, and this is a shock to the world, right? That in 1905, the the Japanese. I mean, that's an Asian nation. It beat a freaking, a European nation, because people are thinking that, the Russians are European, right, from that standpoint. And this is a shock to people. Now, most people are looking at like, okay, yeah, but it's just the Russians. But that wasn't how it was perceived of at the time. It was an actual shock that the Japanese, an Asian nation, is actually an industrialized power.
Yep.
You going to say something?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, okay.
Background noise.
But okay, so back to the build up to war. You have a majority of the players here are all related, right? Especially when it comes to the European aspect.
Yeah.
It's pretty much
heads of the nation, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty much a family feud. We had talked about this last week, but once again, why couldn't they just sit down and figure this shit out? I mean, did thousands upon thousands of people have to die?
Okay, let me ask a question for you. All right, who was related to the Serbs?
No one.
Who was related to the Austro-Hungarians?
No one.
No, hold on. Yeah. Don't the Habsburgs doesn't the German royalty have some kind of relation to the Austro-Hungarians?
Nope, not at this point, because they have more relations with the British and the Tsars of Russia.
The major relations throughout Europe are the aristocracy, and they're not really the power wielders and holders. They got the years of the power wielders and all this kind of stuff, but they're your rich cunts, pretty much your lords and your dukes and all this kind of shit. They're the ones that are mainly related across Europe, but they're not the ones that are throwing the dice.
Well, with the only autocrat that truly was a personal power was Tsar Nicholas.
Mm.
Right. I mean, he himself was the power base, but he had already started to he's trying to modernize his country, and he's trying to do it in more ways than one. In fact, he's already created the Duma, all right, which was going to become the parliament. He's already trying to say, look, we got to change how we deal with the world. We can't be just a single autocratic nation anymore, with just the nobles in charge. We've got to start, developing power. He brutally has suppressed several rebellions. He's now created the Duma to give the people at least some say so in the government. Okay, so he's already trying to limit, but he's doing this at the expense of his own nobility.
Mm.
All right, and so they're this is why they hate. They're very aggravated with the Tsar. So the only one who was close to being an autocrat is the Tsar. The second one is probably Kaiser Wilhelm, but to be honest, his advisors really have more to say than he himself does. Okay, I mean, it sounds kind of stupid, but you got to remember who was the one who put Germany together. It wasn't the Kaiser, all right. It was Bismarck, all right, with utilizing the name of the Kaiser. All right, we're forming the nation under the Kaiser, but the person who actually did it, the one who actually created the German state, was Bismarck.
Yeah, that's why last time when we got together last week, Mad Dogs, that's why that question, did World War I, could it have been prevented, or did it kind of just run away from the hands of the aristocracy? I forget what the exact question was, but that's why it was a really good question, because that's essentially what happened. A few of these people, the kings and queens and dukes and whatnot, they do have power, but it's power to an extent. You're getting the formation of parliaments, and in the in the late 1800s at this point, Serbia, the Kingdom of Serbia, has a kind of how would you put it, like a pseudo constitution. So there are starting to be these huge limits put on the aristocracies, more power going into the hands of the people at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact is, it was a changing of the guard, pretty much. The old European kingdoms, for lack of a better term, weren't gonna stick around much longer.
No.
Go ahead.
No, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, no, it seems like this was a war that needed to happen. Um, in more ways than one, really.
There was an eventuality because, like, say with the fall of empires and all this kind of stuff, what we learnt from England, pre and post World War II, is that they'd lost a hell of a lot of territory. They'd given up a lot of territory. There were a lot of territorial revolts and whatnot, and the empire, as we knew it back in those days, basically ceases to exist today. And these kinds of things were going to happen.
Yeah. So MC. As all the major players here start to mobilize and get on a war footing, do you think it was kind of like it was in the Civil War, where they didn't really understand the totality of just how bad this war was really going to be? You know what I mean?
No, I think that that's true, but although it's in a different sense, the populations um, weren't the ones in World War or in the Civil War. The people who suffered the most were the population centers themselves. Yeah, the troops and the fighting, that was all bad and horrible. Okay, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it was the population and the disruption of the the economic circumstances of the nations that really made suffering really bad across the board in the Civil War. In World War One, the people who really began suffering right off the freaking bat were the freaking soldiers. I mean, whether they were Russian, whether they were German, whether they were English, whether or not they were French or Italian or whatever, because defensive capabilities of armaments, right, specifically because of the machine gun, had come into the forefront. The suffering of the troops, all right, it was undeniable. I mean, when it was unbelievable. All right. This is going to lead to the mass casualties. Everyone's thinking, okay, yeah, there's going to be battlefield casualties, but they're always thinking it's the next guy. This is where 40 is 100% right. The idea was, okay, yeah, if there's casualties, it'll be the kind of casualties that we took place in the Boer War, that we took place in some of these things. It won't be, hundreds of thousands. It'll only be, a few thousand here and a few thousand there. I mean, even with these large standing armies, it won't be that bad. The carnage that's going to entail, the creation of no man's land, all right, that is the furthest thing from their minds.
Yeah, you gotta also remember this is partly where the term "home by Christmas" came from. Oh, don't worry, we'll just go over there, we'll take Berlin, we'll be home by Christmas, not a problem. And then the next year, we'll still be home by Christmas the next year. And then they sort of gave up on that idea. But yeah, that's where that term basically originated from. This is just going to be a quick little skirmish. Don't worry, we'll be home in a couple of months.
Yeah, and I think definitely at the beginning part, the initial stages of the war, there was a special kind of stupidity that was going on among the ranks of military higher ups, especially within the French army. There was still this kind of idea of chivalry, so to speak. There were, as we touched on last time, there's still people doing, cavalry charges. It didn't happen very often, and it certainly didn't happen after the first couple failed. So, but there's still people at this point stuck in the old way of war.
Yeah.
Actually, during the initial phases of the combat, a cavalry charge by the French was actually one of the things that also saved Paris. But I mean, that sounds horrible. All right.
But yeah, 40's right. I mean, like, you have a look at, like, the, say, French tactics, for example, and remembering that the last war that they fought pretty much was with fucking muzzle loading rifles, was that they still had colourful uniforms. They weren't really thinking about camouflage, concealment, or anything like that. And literally, the tactic was that, for defence, you had your three lines: front row fires, second row fires, third row fires. Rinse and repeat. Or if you were going to move across land, it was getting up in a long fucking line and just walking across no man's land. There's no running or anything like that. It was just simply walking because, back in the day, okay, the enemy fired a volley. Okay, they might hit a couple of people, but there's still, several dozen people left standing. Eventually, your walking line will get to the other side and you can fix bayonets or have your bayonets already fixed, but fucking get in there and fucking start stabbing a motherfucker. But that didn't realise the potential of a machine gun. And if you put heaps of people that can be clearly seen, especially at the beginning of the war, because you didn't have your quagmire mud fields and flat no man's lands and things like that. They were still wooded areas, and where you could potentially find some concealment and cover and fire and movement and whatnot. These cunts just didn't fucking grasp the extremely simple premise that a machine gun will just absolutely decimate a formation like that.
Well, no, and this was one of the first wars where you really saw the term shell-shocked come to the forefront, right?
Yeah.
Your casualties weren't just the wounded or dead. They were the guy in the trench next to the man that was killed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that this war is known for. Trench foot comes from this war.
Yeah, those two afflictions actually come from a little bit later, when you do have the quagmires, say like with the Somme and Ypres and all that kind of stuff, where people are in muddy trenches for months and months and months, and there's just no way of getting yourself dry. And shell shock does also come in when they start massing artillery and all this kind of stuff, because the artillery barrages used to last for days. It wasn't like in Vietnam, where like a shooting scooter fire a couple of rounds and fuck off before counter battery fire came in. You had hundreds of guns of many different calibers behind the lines, and they were just shelling and shelling and shelling, and it was days upon days upon days. And it's one thing to think about, okay, some little fucker with a mortar might hit me today in this little barrage, but this was like any fucking minute now for days upon end. This next one might get me. This next one might get me. This next one might get me.
Yeah, no, and you can see pictures of some of these guys, and the look on their face is just I don't know. You could tell they're insane. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're going to get to that, but it doesn't happen obviously right away. But the other thing that's happening as well with what's created things is while the weapons themselves are deadly, all right, communications hasn't kept up. How to communicate, how to move and communicate, all these things are relying upon the signal flags and dumbass shit like this, to include the navies.
Yep.
All right. With the naval communications, they're instead of relying upon the radio, they're so terrified of the enemy picking up radio transmission that they're trying to communicate via flags. All right, and signal communication. So a general in charge of a huge line of tremendous amount of men, all right, sending them into the attack. As soon as the attack begins, he's out of control. I mean, he doesn't even know what's happening, what's going on. He can't change things, he can't adjust things, and this creates a dynamic in and of itself that they never truly solve until really toward the end of the war.
Yeah, they did have hardline telephones behind the lines, but they still had things like runners to relay messages to the front. And this involved fucking bloody General so-and-so back at his fucking field command office several miles behind the lines. He'll get on his little telephone and call the switchboard and say, rightio, I want these three elements to attack, and tell the artillery to walk their fire. But by the time the runner goes from the command, like the switchboard, to the artillery and says, right, well, they want you to start doing this now. And then the next runner gets up to the front lines, and by the time he goes to all the sub-commanders and says, right, this is what you want to do, here's your message, and they go, rightio, all right. Everything's all misaligned and mismatched. The artillery might have stopped early because they got told 15 minutes ago. Where by the time the infantry are ready to actually attack, you're now 20 minutes after the artillery had stopped firing.
Or even worse, it's the other way around, where the infantry attacks and the artillery then begins to walk the freaking fire right over the top of their own men.
Yep, that happened as well. And but it was just a stupid, slow fucking doing things.
Okay, well, this is jumping forward a little bit, but there's also the invention of chemical weapons and gas.
That's a bit further down the track.
Yeah, but how did that change the dynamic of war?
Well, initially, what you're seeing is they've actually already had a conference where they've declared that they won't produce chemical artillery shells. They've all signed this agreement.
Yep.
Okay. Of course, that goes to the wayside. But the biggest thing about what they're looking at it from the initial perspective, what happens is the idea was, okay, we'll hit an area with gas. The men will run away. It'll open a hole. All right. The one thing that nobody is considering, all right, is what they're going to do with these people that are badly injured from these poison clouds, all right, after the war is over.
Mhm.
The horror of those things, the horror of these disabled men coming back from war is really, I mean, at the time, no one's thinking about that. They're really not. They really don't. They know the poison gas is going to be a bad thing, and they're trying to put limits on it. But to be honest, no one's thinking after the fact or what the suffering is going to be from the people who survive these things.
Yeah, and getting around the whole artillery shell piece, like, yep, okay, everyone signed it and said, right, well, we're not going to use them in artillery shells. Okay, so the Germans decided that they were going to use dumb technology like canisters and like emitters, basically smoke machines, pretty much. And it was literally a case of, yep, wait until the wind's blowing in the right direction, and then just fucking either open the canister or turn the smoke machine on, and just let the cloud waft towards the enemy. And this actually ended up badly on the German side a couple of times. Wind change direction.
Yeah, because you have wind shift.
But there was a story about a German, on the Russian front. There was a bunch of Russians that were holding this hard point. I think it was the small fortress and all this.
Oh,
The Germans went and fucking gassed these cunts and thought, oh yeah, they're just going to give up and all this. Well, the blokes who could get up and bugger off after the initial attack, they did leave, leaving all their wounded behind. And these blokes had gotten up, and I think it was. I don't think it was mustard. I think it was something a bit more corrosive. But these blokes,
it was a chlorine. Their artillery started to rust and everything.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, and these guys were literally rotting to death. Like as you could see them rotting to death. Like cunts were coming out and their faces were peeled off and fucking skins coming off their arms, and they decided to attack the Germans. Now the Germans literally went, holy shit, zombie horde, and they shit themselves and ran. The attackers, like the Russians, all like they all end up dying, of course, but fucking like they put up this last stand, and just their appearance scared the fuck out of the Germans.
But no, all right. So anything else towards the beginning of the war that we need to touch upon, or are we about done? And
I think we're about done with the setup of the war now, and now we got to start talking about, okay, let's start talking about the initial battles and how those battles went. And
Yeah, get comfortable.
Battles.
Get comfortable. We're about to get bogged down.
Yeah, pretty much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. We will be doing a Behind the Thrones episode tonight, right after Game of Thrones airs. So come back to check that out. And we'll be back tomorrow. So yeah, good night, good luck. And don't go to France.
Not without a German.